Like the Apostle Paul, I went to one of the best schools. I know it was one of the best because the school songs we had to sing said so. And because when its students periodically engage in toxic antisocial behaviour, it makes the headlines, which wouldn't be the case if they came from poverty high school. The conventional wisdom espoused for people who went to such schools is that we have been especially privileged and that we therefore have an obligation to make a genuine contribution to society. We are regarded as having had a head start in life. And so, since we are getting more out of life than those who lack such privileges, we should give more back. Well, call me ungrateful if you like, but when it comes to those things in life that really matter, I'm not sure that the benefits of my privileged education actually outweigh its crippling legacy. Some wise person, was it Bishop Leslie Newbigin or perhaps Jacques Ellul, I can't remember, said that our society likes to administer the gospel in small doses so as to inoculate people against catching the real thing. And on that basis, I'd say that my school was indeed the cream of society because it did exactly that extremely well. On the basis of the reading we heard from the letter to the church at Philippi, it seems that the Apostle Paul shared my view that a privileged head start in life is a poisoned chalice. Paul had an impeccable pedigree and a top-shelf education. Yet after describing his blessings count, he says, "Whatever gains I had in all this, I have come to regard these things as loss because of Christ." Or in other words, there might have been some positives, but I can now see that the negatives outweighed them. And in fact, he goes on to say it in rather more colourful language than that. Our terribly polite English translators always make use of the 7-second delay to make sure that the Bible stays suitable for families. But where we have Paul saying in most translations, "I now regard these things as rubbish," Paul's actual word was a bit of common street Greek, meaning excrement. If Paul had been speaking Australian English, it would have come out as, "You might consider all this to be a perfect head start in life, but I now regard it as a load of shit. I've turned my back on it all so that I can give myself totally to Christ and be embraced fully by him." So why? Why was Paul's opinion of his privileged head start so hostile that it came out in the kind of language that we have to bleep out in case the kiddies are listening? I'm going to put that question on hold for just a sec, because I think that if we go and have a look at the story we heard from John's Gospel, we might be able to find ourselves in a better angle to get back into that question. So on his way to Jerusalem for the last time, Jesus spends a night enjoying a dinner party in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. During the evening, Mary breaks open a very expensive bottle of fragrant oils, and she poured out the oil and used it to massage Jesus' feet. As we heard, Judas Iscariot has a fit and growls, "What do you think you're doing? That stuff's worth a fortune. Why wasn't it sold and the money put to work to do something for the poor?" But Jesus comes to her defense, saying, "Get off her case, Judas. She brought that oil and kept it to use in preparing me for a decent burial. There will never be any shortage of opportunities to do something worthwhile for the poor, but you won't always have the opportunity to do anything worthwhile for me." Now, on the surface of it, putting aside whatever ulterior motives Judas might have had for wanting the money in the bag, he seemed to be voicing a perfectly honourable ideology. Perhaps he went to a good school too and knows that you are not supposed to just milk your privileges for all they're worth, but rather take what you've acquired and give something back to society, especially to relieve the plight of those who have not had the benefits of such a good head start in life. Now, the Jesus who was described in many of the churches that I've been part of would have backed Judas up on that for sure. A good, solid theology of social obligation. But the real Jesus said he was wrong. The real Jesus honors and accepts a wasteful and extravagant gift and says that sometimes such wasteful behavior is more important than giving to the poor. How could he even begin to justify the suggestion that giving someone, himself in fact, a foot massage with far too much of an outrageously expensive perfumed oil was a more appropriate use of time, energy, and resources than taking action to relieve the plight of the poor? This is no abstract historical question for us either, because aren't we doing much the same thing? Aren't we gathered here right now, committing time, energy, and some fairly expensive resources to a similarly wasteful and non-productive act of devotion? Couldn't it easily be argued that we would be far better off putting the time and resources into doing something useful, in doing something that would actually be of some tangible benefit to the world, or at least to some of its less privileged occupants? What are we doing singing songs and praying prayers while the people of Myanmar are still trying to pull their loved ones out of the earthquake rubble? Why don't we get out there and do something useful? These are fair questions, tough questions even. But Jesus doesn't give a simple answer that might have been expected. And neither does Paul, because he takes all the things that people commonly see as placing a person in the ideal place to make a worthwhile, benevolent contribution to society, and then he writes them off as a load of shit. They get in the way of what really matters, he says. And perhaps Jesus is saying the same thing, that even such worthy desires as to do something about the plight of the poor can get in the way of what really matters. To Mary, what really mattered was intimacy with Jesus. And Paul says that what really matters is to know Jesus, to be united with him in life, death, and resurrection. And that, he says, is a tough race that still lies ahead of him. I don't think I'm stretching it too far to say that he seems to be implying that it is a tougher race still for those who have had a privileged head start. Why? Well, I can only tell you why it is for me. And that's that after a head start like that, I am so addicted to feeling that I can control the world myself and that I can fix its problems and contribute meaningfully to its welfare, that it is almost impossible to bring myself to release my grip and just love and be loved and trust God to call the shots. At a very formative stage of my life, I was shaped with a sense of ego and entitlement and power that said that I could call the shots. And it all gets in the way and cripples me. I think that the truth that Paul and Jesus were both pointing to here is that those of us who, like Judas, are convinced that the welfare of the world is dependent on our precious gifts usually end up causing more problems than we solve. Perhaps that's partly because we tend to separate ourselves off from a needy world and so address every issue but our own. By contrast, those who are willing to be so irresponsible and wasteful as to commit their first energies to knowing Jesus intimately in genuine devotion and worship begin to be transfigured in the image of Jesus and face up to their own brokenness. And that enables them to approach the world with quite a different attitude. And I can tell you that when the poor and needy are on the receiving end of our efforts at addressing their plight, They have no trouble telling the difference between those who see the face of Jesus in them and pour out gifts accordingly, and those who think that the world should be grateful to have the benefit of our privileged gifts and attention. Each time we gather for worship, in laying aside our compulsions to remake the world as we think it should be, and just become part of a congregation who indulge in this wasteful and unproductive celebration of God, we are, in fact, almost incidentally, offering a great gift to the world. Because if you want a glimpse of heaven, just picture the intimate communion between Mary and Jesus at that dinner party. And you'll realize that worship itself brings at least one little bit of the world more in tune with that picture. And more than that, it sends us back out to the poor who will always be with us with a greater ability to love instead of just a social obligation to do charity. So perhaps the wasteful extravagance of our worship is not so disconnected from the needs of the real world. Opening ourselves to intimate communion with Jesus is opening ourselves to the most world-changing power in the universe. But let me close with a warning before we congratulate ourselves too much. Our willingness to involve ourselves in worship does not prove that we are opening ourselves to intimacy with Jesus. We all know that a man giving perfume to his wife could just as likely be doing it to disguise his unwillingness to open himself up to her in real intimacy. And I can attest from my own struggles to reverse the inoculation of my privileged upbringing that the best way to avoid intimacy with Jesus is to put on a good facade of religious devotion. We can go through the motions so convincingly that we might even pull the wool over our own eyes. But our actions are more about maintaining our image of respectability and competence. We don't make fools of ourselves for Jesus in the way that lovers always have made fools of themselves for the ones they love. And as Frederick Buechner said, whether our worship is a Quaker meeting, a pontifical high mass, the family service at First Presbyterian, or a holy roller happening, unless there is an element of joy and foolishness in the proceedings, the time would be better spent doing something useful.